Right, it is now my great pleasure to introduce our second session of the day. Welcome back, everyone, from that short break. Just before we do kick off this session, I'd like to turn your attention to a quick poll question before we get started with our next session. So take a look at your screen. The question here is, gender responsive procurement is, and choose all that you consider applicable. So go ahead and take a moment now to look at some of the options there. We've got quite a few there, so do take a look and take a minute to read some of those options and begin your selection process, perhaps focusing on the top one or two that you agree with the most. There we go. Thank you so much. We see responses coming in now. Great. All right. So I see here we've got one that's starting to lead the way. It looks like procurement that contributes to the equal access to economic and opportunities for both genders. Seems to be one of the leading ones that we're seeing come through. Also, procurement from businesses that have gender-sensitive policies, perhaps maternity, paternity leave, modified flexible work hours, in-house childcare facilities. So we're starting to see that come through. We have about 40% participating. So please continue to submit your responses now. Take a look at your screen, read through the options. And again, let us know which ones you agree with the most. The question or the prompt here is gender responsive procurement is, and choose all that you consider applicable. So how would you define gender responsive procurement? We're a little over 50% participated, so please continue to submit your responses. We should be wrapping this up shortly. And I see here the leading answer so far continues to be that it contributes to equal access. Oh, I'm sorry, a new leader has emerged here. Procurement that contributes to the equal access for economic opportunities for both genders. So that is our leading option here. And it looks like we are just about wrapping up the poll here. So there we go. So this is great, a great prompt for our panelists and our moderator who's coming up as they get ready to discuss this very important topic. This session is going to be titled Gender Inclusive Public Procurement and EGP. And in this critical session, we are honored to have Ms. Whoops, a couple things popping up on my screen here. They don't stop. All right, Ms. Keiko Nowacka leading this important conversation. So without further ado, let's make some introductions here. Keiko is a senior social development specialist with a focus on gender and development in the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the ADB. In this role, she focuses on women's entrepreneurship and promoting the ADB's gender mainstreaming mandate, including gender transformative agenda. Prior to joining the ADB, Keiko led the gender program at the OECD's Development Center, where she was responsible for the social institutions and gender index. She also held positions at UNESCO, where she led the first global report on gender and culture and focused on gender mainstreaming in the cultural and creative industries. She has also worked as an operations manager at CAMFED, an NGO supporting secondary girls' education in sub-Saharan Africa. She has a PhD from the University of Cambridge and is a graduate of the University of Sydney. Joining the panel, we have Leslie Harper, Senior Sector Specialist at the Fiscal Management Division for the IDB. Leslie has over 20 years of experience as an international development professional working on Latin America and the Caribbean, and is an expert in public procurement reform, modernization, and gender and diversity inclusion. She joined the Inter-American Development Bank in 1999 and currently serves as coordinator for the topic of public procurement for the Institutions for Development Department. She oversees programs in the 26 IDB member countries, including portfolio and knowledge management. She is also the gender and diversity focal point for the Fiscal Management Division, where she is responsible for portfolio monitoring and mainstreaming of gender and diversity in fiscal projects. She has been the lead on high-profile events and knowledge products to promote cutting-edge trends in the topic. Also participating on the panel, we are excited to have Rubina Shaheen, who is a Principal Procurement Specialist, Procurement Division 1 in the Procurement, Portfolio, and Financial Management Department at the ADB. Ms. Shaheen is assigned to support the ADB's portfolio in the Central and West region of the ADB, and she has over 26 years experience working in public procurement on various infrastructure projects. Prior to joining the ADB in 2010, she served the United Nations in various capacities in Sri Lanka, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. Ms. Shaheen holds a master's degree in business administration focused on finance and accounting from the Preston Institute of Management, Science, and Technology in Pakistan, and a bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Engineering and Technology in Pakistan. Our third panelist is Teresa Nierderle, who is a principal economist and gender expert at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. Teresa works and advises investment teams on the intersection between infrastructure and gender equality, as well as economic inclusion, with a focus on Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, as well as Turkey. Prior to joining the EBRD, she gained experience across the private and public sector, including in management consulting as an advisor to governments in the area of sustainable private sector development. And last but not least, we are joined by Despoina Curia, who is a supplier diversity and sustainability analyst with corporate procurement at the World Bank Group. She is part of the team that mainstreams sustainability considerations into over $1.7 billion of annual purchases for the World Bank Group's global offices, and leads corporate procurement's efforts in promoting and increasing the participation of women and other diverse-owned businesses within the WBG procurement processes and across its supply chain. Prior to joining the bank, she served as a sustainable procurement expert for the UN Environment's Sustainable Program, supporting the operationalization of sustainable procurement across the UN system, as well as the management of One Planet Network's Sustainable Public Procurement Program. In the past, she has been part of UNOP's Sustainable Procurement team and has also worked with the International Training Center of the ILO on procurement training delivery. Keiko, now over to you so you can lead this important discussion.
Thank you so much, Roger, and good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening to all the participants on this third day of the 7th APPN conference. So as Roger said, my name is Keiko Nowacka. I'm a senior gender specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and I have the great pleasure to be the moderator for this session and to be able to hear from some of my esteemed colleagues from other multilateral development banks on the work that they've been doing to promote gender responsive procurement through their operations as well as through their institutions. So first of all, I thought the poll responses was a really good actually introduction to what is gender responsive procurement, or you may hear us talk about the acronym GRP. So gender responsive procurement has a wide range of definitions. Some of them are on this screen, and a very classic one is sourcing from women-owned businesses. And it may be of interest to many of you here that women-owned businesses do not represent 50% of all businesses in the Asia Pacific. Actually, when we look at women-owned businesses across the region, they vary from 25% in Southeast Asia that are owned or led by a woman, but it goes down to maybe 10% in South Asia. So there is a very important gender gap in terms of ownership of businesses. And part of the issues are women's access to markets and trade. And this is where procurement could be one solution. But gender responsive procurement has a wide range of definitions other than just sourcing from women-owned businesses. It is also looking at, as some of these kind of poll responses indicate, looking at businesses that actually promote gender equality through their supply chains, through the different types of policies that they have for their employees. That's also equally important. So the definition of GRP is a bit broader than just sourcing from women-owned businesses, and it complements other initiatives to source from other groups that are perhaps more marginal or find it more difficult to access markets. This also includes sourcing from businesses that are owned or led by ethnic minority groups, for example. These are also important ways to even out the playing field, which is at the moment unfortunately full of some gaps. So why would gender responsive procurement be important, and what does it kind of constitute? We're going to hear a lot about that from our panelists today. So I won't go into detail about the different mechanisms that gender responsive procurement can entail, because we will be hearing some really fascinating examples from our panelists. But Given the current COVID-19 context, there is a real opportunity to use gender responsive procurement as a tool for women's economic empowerment and to support their access to markets, and also to promote more sustainable and inclusive building back better. When we talk about that, that also means how can we also promote better work opportunities and labor force opportunities for women. So it's a great opportunity now, especially during COVID, because as many of you are probably aware, many businesses have been severely affected. Women's businesses have been severely affected by the pandemic. And for example, the ADB did a rapid assessment of businesses in Vietnam as well as in Mongolia, and something between 75 to 85% of women-owned businesses reported concern of business survival because they didn't have enough markets, and actually they reported that they would require external government support to be able to survive. So many of the issues about women-owned businesses relate to the fact that they tend to be smaller, they tend to not be as linked up to supply chains, they tend to be concentrated in the informal sectors. So there are kind of underlying gender inequalities, but there is a way for procurement, and as we'll hear during this session, to perhaps address some of those gaps and be a very proactive force and thinking about how do we build back better. So So something that one of the poll questions that will come up a little bit later, and we'll be asking you a list of different questions, and something that maybe your participants may not be aware of, is that whether it's in the private sector or in the public sector, women-owned businesses only represent 1% of procurement, as far as the data kind of tells us. And that last caveat is very important because there are also very important data gaps, and there are a lot of things that we don't know about how many women-owned businesses or kind of gender-responsive enterprises are benefiting from public or private procurement because it's just not being measured. So that is a very important point. So without much ado, I'd like to kind of move on to our first panelist who will give us a presentation, and that's Leslie Harper, the Senior Sector Specialist from the Inter-American Development Bank. And then we'll follow, that will be followed by a moderated panel with the other speakers that Roger has already introduced. And as you can see, we have a broad spectrum of other multilateral development banks. And again, we'll hear from both how they've been promoting GRP in their own operations, and you'll be able to hear concrete examples from countries, as well as what the World Bank Group is doing as an institution. So Leslie, over to you for your presentation, please.
Great, thank you so much, Keiko. And I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Okay, you can see it? So before I begin, I'm sorry?
Yes, okay. We do see it. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful, great. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the Asian Development Bank, Elias McCoven team, for the invitation to join you again for your Asia Pacific Network. It's always a pleasure. I hope sometime soon in the future I'll be able to join you in person. So I'm very pleased to be presenting in this key panel on gender responsive procurement. The Inter-American Development Bank, Empowering Women, is at the forefront of our work in the Latin American Caribbean region, and it's a cornerstone of the IDB's Vision 2025 strategy to promote sustainable and inclusive development and address the challenges that countries face coming out of the COVID crisis. So today I'm going to go over some of the basics of gender responsive procurement, why it's important, barriers, and some steps that can be taken to mitigate those challenges. So what is gender responsive procurement? It's many things, but the definition I'm using for my presentation is the harnessing of the purchasing power of the state to advance public policy objectives of gender in a country. And it could be through the more narrow definition of promoting women-owned businesses in public procurement, or the broader definition, which would include businesses that are gender responsive, regardless of the gender identity of their owners, the business owners. So why the focus on public procurement? As we all know, public procurement is a large percentage of GDP, particularly in developing countries. And as governments engage at all levels of the procurement process, it's an area that is uniquely placed to have an impact on gender equality. From the supplier side, a high percentage of small and medium-sized enterprises are run by women. These enterprises are widely recognized as motors for growth in the world economy, representing around 80% of the global job market. Also, it's estimated that women-owned businesses reinvest up to 90% of their income in their families and communities. Thus, the increase in the participation of women in the public procurement market translates into social and economic growth, which is particularly important in this time of COVID, which has increased female poverty. And so now more than ever, public policies to reduce these gaps are critical, and thus the focus on promoting women in public procurement and how it can contribute towards achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment, and also number 1 and 8 regarding poverty and economic growth. So to that regard, the gender perspective in public procurement is of growing interest around the world. However, and there have been many advances. However, there's still a major gap. Worldwide, less than 1% of the estimated 10 trillion spent annually in global public procurement is awarded to women-owned businesses. And for example, in the United States, 40% of businesses are women-owned, yet they make up only 4.7% of government contracts. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, where public procurement represents around 30% of GDP, only 1% of all the contracts are awarded to women-owned businesses. So what are some of the barriers? Why is this? Women-owned businesses face many barriers, including barriers related to the design of the tender. They're often too big, too complex, too many administrative and cost requirements, for example, requiring audited account statements. There are barriers related to size and qualification, disproportionate requirements related to the financial health and turnover of the business. Often governments do this out of habit, requiring levels of experience or certifications that are not necessary for the size and risk of the tender at hand, but are onerous and costly for small businesses. For example, asking for 20 years experience and 100 employees for a small catering job. There's also barriers related to access to information. Many women-owned businesses in rural areas or lack access to the internet. There are barriers related to business capabilities, for example, how to develop a bid, and barriers related to payment behavior. Governments are often late in paying, and small businesses often don't have the financial cushion to absorb the delay. So what are some of the measures to promote women in public procurement? So in this slide, I have grouped the measures into two main categories. The first is on vertical, which refers to the top-down policies, and the second, horizontal measures, which include measures to reduce barriers to entry. So in terms of vertical policies, some examples include targets, which are mandatory goals for procuring entities. For example, in the United States, the statutory target for small business owned and controlled by women is not less than 5% of the total value of all federal contracts. There's subcontracting, where procuring entities require or request that certain percentage of subcontracting go to women-owned businesses. This is a fruitful area for government intervention because it leverages both the buying power and innovation of government prime contractors. Subcontractors are often a small firm's entrance into the broader public procurement market. You also have preferences. This category is probably perhaps best known and widely used. They often involve granting a price preference or margin of preference to firms that are eligible for preferential treatment. In these cases, the procuring entities artificially increase the bid prices of the non-preferred firms by a set number of percentage points, while making no adjustments to the bid prices of the preferred firms. Award is then made to the firm with the lowest evaluated as opposed to price. Alternatively, the preference may take the form of additional points. You also have reservations or set-asides. In the case of set-asides, only a certain type of supplier, in this case women-owned businesses, is allowed to bid. The critical difference between this approach and the use of bid preferences is that under set-asides, there's a segregation of competition, as only women-owned businesses can compete against each other. This measure is one of the riskier ones from the perspective of distorting the market and decreasing competition. If this approach is taken, it is essential to do a market survey to ensure that there are enough suppliers that exist to provide the good or service. And it's important to have an exit strategy to ensure that they do not become a mechanism to subsidize inefficiency. In terms of horizontal measures, in many countries, the vertical measures I just mentioned might not be possible for a legal or political standpoint. So countries often focus on horizontal measures that use a gender perspective to level the playing field. Many of these measures have the added benefit of supporting not just women-owned businesses, but also small and medium-sized enterprises in general and other economically disadvantaged groups. For example, at the IDB, we're currently working on research regarding Indigenous peoples and on the LGBTQ community in public procurement. So what are some of the measures in this category? Here we have design. You limit the size, time pressure. You standardize and simplify the tender process, which lowers the transaction cost of contracting. With regard to requirements and criteria, making sure that they're proportionate to the task at hand. Access to information, making information on public procurement opportunities and process more public and easy to obtain. And then training. In the area of training, it's important to train procurement officers on how to have a gender perspective, as this may be a completely new area for some of them. And on the supplier side, many buyers find it hard in practice to find qualified women's enterprises that can compete at the same cost and quality as other businesses. This is why it's so important to support the supply side as well. Governments must establish programs that build the capacity of women-owned businesses to compete successfully in the public procurement markets. This can include, for example, post-tender feedback sessions, guidelines and materials to help with the process, and training on how to draft competitive proposals. And then finally, government paying behavior, make sure they pay on time. So how does this relate to EGP? So now I'm going to talk about electronic government procurement. What is commonly referred to as EGP is now more than just one transactional platform to submit bids and award contracts. Now we have a wide array of digital solutions and platforms that support the procurement function that are still grouped under EGP. These digital solutions are important as they're one of the most effective ways to include the gender perspective in public procurement, as it can be embedded in the design and employment of the systems without having to go through major reform in legislation and regulations. So here's how EGP can help with the following barriers. In terms of access to information, women-owned businesses may not have the same capacity to search through several different procurement postings to find one worth bidding on or for subcontracting opportunities. Women business owners often struggle more with family obligations than men, so the ability to communicate anywhere, anytime, and not be limited to geographic constraints can make a big difference. Business capabilities, the submission of bids through electronic means can reduce transaction costs for bidders. Similarly, the cost of travel and staff allocated to logistical tasks can be decreased due to the introduction of technology in the process. And the submission of payment requests may also occur online, allowing for faster payment times, as many women-owned businesses struggle with liquidity. And then finally, data. Many countries really don't know how many suppliers are women-owned, so you can design your EGP system with tags and identifiers to see how much business is going to the sector, as you want your supplier universe to have a fair representation. For this, you'll need a supplier registry that can identify women-owned businesses, and you need a good system of business intelligence that captures that information and transforms it into actionable data that the public sector can use to fine-tune its policies, and that the suppliers can use to identify opportunities. Having evidence and data are important to be able to make the business case and show the benefits of gender-responsive procurement. However, it's important to note that if a gender perspective is not included in the design and development, it can also increase the gaps. For example, all of us have done tasks on digital systems where you find complex logins, dealing with authentication, too much information requested. It takes time. It is critical, therefore, to design EGP systems with the final user in mind and use a gender lens if possible. So I'm going to give you a concrete example. There are EGP systems where if you are idle for a certain amount of time, you'll be logged out. Imagine how this affects a single mother entrepreneur who has to take care of kids who may interrupt her. At least in my region in the Western Hemisphere, women often have a larger burden in the home and get interrupted more. A system that is designed to log out when you're not tending to it every 5 minutes will affect women more. So you need to make your EGP system sensitive to these factors. Like with anything, if you don't include a gender perspective, it can make things worse, and EGP is the same way. So it's important to stop and think how your system might affect women. Do it right, and you can reduce the gender gap. Do it wrong, and you can actually increase it. So what are some of the steps? So once a country decides to develop a program to promote women in public procurement, there's some steps that are commonly taken. I think one of the first and most important is to have your definition of a woman-owned business or gender-responsive business. Another thing that's important is to have a market study. You need to know, what is your supplier universe? Identification of stakeholders who are working with, women-owned businesses in the country, and women chambers of commerce, NGOs, and women's groups. It's very important to have everyone on board and see what's going on in that sector. You need a diagnostic assessment and identification of barriers. If you're going to tackle a particular barrier, you need to make sure that it's actually a barrier for women-owned businesses in your country, because it varies greatly country to country. You need an action plan and a decision on which type of measure you're going to implement. And then finally, the implementation of the measures. In the case of the Latin American Caribbean region, with the support of the IDB as part of the activities in the Inter-American Network on Government Procurement, the country signed a declaration in 2015 to promote women in public procurement. So use of the support of the network provided a framework for procurement agencies to collaborate and work together to advance the topic as a region. So this photo is from a network meeting that includes pioneers in the topic of women in public procurement, including from the heads of procurement from the Dominican Republic and Chile, as well as representatives from Argentina, Jamaica, and St. Lucia. So use networks when you got them. It's very helpful. So in terms of provide a couple country examples illustrating these steps and how they were implemented. In the case of the United States, the Public Procurement Agency, GSA, passed a Federal Acquisition Act, whereby 5% of government procurement should go to women-owned businesses. The United States has the luxury of having a wide array of spending on procurement. So they use this tremendous spending power to incubate women-owned businesses who use the program to reach operational and financial viability and then grow into bigger markets. This is done through their Small Business Association, or SBA, which is devoted to matching underrepresented sectors of the economy with growth programs, one of them giving access to the public procurement market. In the case of Chile, their strategy is very horizontal. Apologies. The objective has been to make it as easy as possible for women-owned businesses to become a government supplier and access opportunities in the public procurement market. They've invested heavily in technology to lower transaction costs on the supplier side and capacity building to educate women-owned businesses on the opportunities and tools available to them. Chile has also invested in certifying women-owned businesses that supply to the government in a program called Sello Empresa Mujer. This certification program generates data to benchmark and evaluate efforts in Chile, and also created an association of women suppliers that has become an invaluable platform to outreach businesses. In the case of the Dominican Republic, it's more of an example of a vertical strategy. To that regard, they have developed, they have a law which sets out preferential purchasing to support small and medium-sized enterprises, and legislated that 20% of purchases through that program should be from businesses run by women. Their strategy is based on matching supply and demand by surveying goods and services that women-owned businesses were producing and matching them with demand in the public sector. They developed a supplier registry and catalog of women suppliers with more than 11,000 women registered. And they have an outreach program to support the promotion of women-owned businesses in non-traditional sector like works, PPPs, et cetera. And finally, they have an important awareness building program and activities. In the case of Argentina, and here I'm talking about the city of Buenos Aires being one of the largest and developed metropolitan areas in the Southern Cone, had an important presence of women-owned businesses in its economy and private sector commerce. However, this was not reflected in the city's suppliers, as they only represented 15% of companies being awarded public sector contracts. The government of City of Buenos Aires undertook an important initiative to develop a certification program called Sello Empresa Mujer, similar to what was done in Chile, to generate data, incentivize the participation of women-owned businesses in the public procurement market. The most important thing to highlight from this example is that not only did the program certify ownership, but also included a category of companies that had good corporate practices towards women. And it's also innovative as it was at the subnational level. So what are some of the challenges that we see? I mean, there are many, but I think some of the top three would include the digital gender gap or digital divide. Well, in Latin America as a whole, is fairly equal in terms of access to the internet and mobile phones. That is not the case in other parts of the world, including what I understand in Southeast Asia and Africa. Also within Latin America and the Caribbean, you have a lot of differences between countries. For example, in Guatemala, access to the internet for women is only 35% and access to mobile phones, 64%, compared to 45% and 74%, respectively, for men. In terms of limited data, good quality data that is collected and made publicly available is essential. That is why certification programs are so important. So we need to work on getting more data on how many procurement exercises are currently used to realize gender equality. National level indicators should be developed and updated on a regular basis. and explore how gender equality is being addressed at different stages of the procurement cycle. Currently, most of the focus has been on the training of suppliers and selection criteria. This could be expanded to include, for example, market testing, risk identification and assessment, designing technical specifications, among others. And then finally, the need for capacity building. On the supplier side, many women-owned businesses have limited experience with public procurement. In the case of EGP, resistance to participation is not always due to technical concerns, but rather often stems from a basic lack of familiarity on how to pursue business opportunities with government. And on the procurement agency side, the lack of understanding on how to achieve gender objectives through public procurement practices remains to be a top challenge for policymakers. So in terms of the future, at the IDB, we approach gender inclusion in public procurement from an economic subrepresentation perspective. Although there's a general perception and even belief that there is fair access to public procurement market, there are economic groups that continue to be underrepresented, such as I mentioned before, small and medium-sized enterprises, LGBTQ, Indigenous peoples, et cetera. So gender-sensitive procurement is one of those underrepresented areas and will continue to be key in our work to ensure that public procurement markets and systems operate efficiently, which among many things also means that they take advantage of the whole universe of suppliers that could potentially access it, which is important, obviously, also for increasing competition. In the next 10 years, we should strive not only to promote and incentivize women-owned business participation, but also to expand the economic results of this program by mapping, acknowledging, and rewarding with the public procurement market all the companies that have progressive, inclusive, and state-of-the-art practices regarding gender and women. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that great presentation. Provides us with a great overview and framework for the rest of the discussion for today, as well as some really concrete examples from some of the work that's already happening in Latin America. Some work that ADB has been doing so far in supporting in our operations has been a benchmarking kind of study that we're doing with UN Women for the Asia Pacific, which we hope to publish next year. And our initial results show that there hasn't been as many kind of dedicated programs at the country level as there have been in other regions. So there's a lot for us, I think, in Asia to learn from others, though the challenges that you've pointed out about why women-owned businesses don't have the similar access to procurement opportunities are unfortunately universal in many senses. So we see that these exist not only in Africa, Asia, Latin America, as well as other global regions. So I'm going to now start the next part of this session, which is a kind of a moderated panel with all of our speakers. And I'll have some questions from our other panelists that will be joining us today. So my first one is for my ADB colleague, Rubina, who's now on the screen. So what has been ADB's approach to gender responsive procurement? And are there some elements that from Leslie's presentation on what the IADB has been doing that could be relevant for Asia Pacific governments? Over to you, Rubina.
Thank you, Keiko and Leslie, for a wonderful presentation. I would just start with giving a figure of the total world population. We are about 7.9 billion as of November 2021, out of which 49.5% represented by the women and 50.15% by the men. But in the coming years, the women population is going to exceed by the men population. This emphasizes that we have to take care of the equal participation in our women in different businesses so that we can improve our GDP. So out of 7.9 billion, about 60%, but like 4.3 billion is from the Asia and the Pacific region. And ADB Strategy 2030 Operational Priority 2 states that ADB is committed to support gender equality through gender inclusive project designs in at least 75% of sovereign and non-sovereign operations by 2030. So ADB is very much focused into this area and looking forward to do more and more in this gender inclusive and gender responsive procurement. The ADB Strategy 2030 also requires to explore the gender responsive procurement to enable women-led enterprises for public bidding as service providers and establish better links with the women's skills and entrepreneurship development programs. As of now, each of the projects that we are designing, there are some certain gender elements that are inbuilt into the project design. And those some targets are set which are to be complied during implementation of the projects. For example, in our infrastructure projects, ADB proactively engaged employing more women in skilled and semi-skilled jobs in various sectors. And also we ensure that women are being capacities provided or an enabling environment is provided during implementation of the projects to enhance the women participation. Just an example, in the Georgia, we are doing one project in Georgia in water, agriculture, and natural resources, where we look into the data, and the data shows that the land, the piece of the land owned by the men and women, there is a big difference. The majority of the land is owned by the men. So this already discouraged women in enhancing their more ownership to the land and less access to the financial resources. And this is one of the hindrances in the women participation in the businesses or in the procurement. Similarly, there is another project that we have in India in the energy sector, where under the technical assistance of ADB, TA funds have been allocated to support a government entity that will be facilitating the training of the women driver as a commercial driver, about 200 female women drivers. It's not only the driving capacity, but also to help them to it will be four wheels and the two wheels, and including the maintenance, use of technology, including the GPS, functioning of the vehicle mobility, health hygiene, training, also the communication skills, and also the financial management. So this is already a step towards inclusion of the women in the procurement and in our projects. We are not only paying attention to investment projects, but in addition to that, we are also paying attention in our private sector at how we can ensure women participation in the businesses. Recently, in August 2021, ADB has launched, the private sector of ADB has launched the Women Finance Exchange. It's a designated digital portal with an integrated knowledge hub to provide a range of the services for its financial institutions, members, and to a certain extent to the women-owned small enterprises. Ultimately, this platform will serve as a resource for all the industry stakeholders. Through the platform, financial institution can also source knowledge on the gender-responsive financing digital tools and will be supported to identification of the cutting-edge technologies. So this is the project. We are piloting this project in the Papua New Guinea, and this will help also to support the women. And also with the use of the digital platform, it will also help to get data about the women participation. Now, in terms of purely about the procurement perspective, gender responsive procurement, as of now, the focus is more on the implementation part of the gender. But in terms of the entire bidding process and what we need to put into the bidding document itself, as of now, I would say both at the operational and the institutional level, there is no defined statement for the gender responsive procurement. Neither any specific targets have been set as of now. But with this, as Keiko has also mentioned, that we have already launched a recent report with ADB jointly with the UN. So that report also highlight to how we can enhance the gender responsive procurement, both in our institutional and operational financing projects. In terms of what our colleague Leslie have mentioned in her presentation, I think I agree with most of her recommendation, which makes sense, are very practical, and it's a long way to go. I would start with this, starting with to enable the GRP, a gender responsive environment in a specific country or DMCs. Of course, it has to be supported by the government-led initiative. It has to be included into their laws, whether it's a procurement law or any financial laws, which support that kind of activity. There is a need to create awareness and advocate the need for the gender responsive procurement in the in our step of the procurement process. Also, most importantly, the capacity building, the training, and I think this is one of the weaker area where the emphasis is required. Capacity building to be done at the time of there are various areas where we can do a standalone or during the project processing stage. We can have them separate, or maybe when we invite the road shows for the contractors, consultant, and the suppliers. we should focus into the data. If there are women entrepreneur in that area or in the sector, we should invite them. And also we can help them to, if they're, because of their size of the businesses are very small, we can help them to link with the main contractors, and they can always participate as a subcontractor. So this is one of the opportunity to start with by the time they grow by themselves. Having then also, I fully agree with the EGP system. That can also start the starting point to have the database of our women, and also to provide an efficient platform for the women, because women normally in most of the countries, they have more burden, I would say, compared to men. They have to spend more time with the family, house chores, as well as if they are running the business. Having the e-platform will help them to efficiently participate in the bidding process. And of course, this goes with the capacity building of the women-led organization. There was one point was mentioned about setting aside business for the women is bit, I would say, challenging in a way, unless this type of criteria are set by the policy at the higher level. So this is, I think, the area that we need to look internally within ADB and our DMC levels. I'll stop here. Over to you, Keiko. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rubina. Thank you also for doing a great job in presenting some of the work that we're doing at ADB on supporting women-owned businesses and how we are at the beginning of looking at gender-responsive procurement. There have been some kind of questions in the chat that I just wanted to quickly perhaps respond to before we move on, and encouraging everyone to please put more questions in the chat, because you have these experts here on the panel who are going to be here to be able to respond to them. So one of them was about the definition. So the definition of women-owned business is quite challenging in our region of the Asia Pacific. Not that many countries actually have a definition. ADB supported the government of Indonesia last year to adopt a definition of women-owned business. And I know there are a few countries in the ASEAN region, such as Vietnam, for example, who also has a definition. And ADB is also working with the Philippines to adopt a definition. So many countries don't have one. So this is, I think, one of the first steps, because you can't identify where the gaps are if you don't have a clear definition. And that is a policy challenge. So in general, the definition looks, a very common definition is looking at 50% plus ownership, or looking at also the leadership structure, so looking at the C-suite. So an IFC definition, for example, looks at 20% of CEOs, CFOs, et cetera, to be women. So there are different definitions out there, but a very common one would be 50% plus that is owned by a woman. But this is also evolving. There's also some questions about how do you reconcile procurement, which is very much a merit-based process, with gender-responsive procurement. And perhaps just to kind of clarify that gender-responsive procurement is not just about target setting. It's not about, and as Rubina said, about having a set aside that so much resources are for women-owned businesses. It's also about looking at the processes of procurement and to see how they can be what we call in the gender world gender responsive. So I think Leslie gave some really great examples of different ways that procurement that appears to be gender neutral actually can indirectly discriminate against women because of the other kind of cultural and social norms, I think that some people mentioned, that exist across our region. So, for example, women are more likely to be responsible for childcare. Women's businesses tend to be a bit smaller, so they can't compete for larger bids. So there are some kind of underlying factors that procurement, which may appear to be neutral, is actually sometimes not that neutral. A kind of a parallel example would be, and where ADB has a kind of strong track record, is lending, for example, to women-owned businesses. For a long time, a lot of the kind of financial sector lending that ADB did, we have been setting targets, for example, because we recognize that even though that there are some biases in the way that banks, for example, lend to do with collateral. And so to try to find alternatives to collateral as a way to support women to access loans. So it's not saying that women-owned businesses should have always an additional advantage, but it's also thinking about how the processes themselves can be tweaked to be more gender responsive. So looking at processes, not just at targets. So gender responsive procurement really is part of a longer process. And I think this is going to be it's a great question. And it's also a very challenging one on how do you reconcile all that? And it's very complicated. It was great to hear from Leslie on some of the examples from Latin America on how they have been able to do that. I'm going to now switch to another region, and ask my colleague from the EBRD, Teresa Nierderle, to answer kind of, we've heard a lot now from the Inter-American Development Bank as well as the Asian Development Bank on some entry points on how to promote gender-responsive procurement in operations. What has been the EBRD's approach, and what are some of the processes and mechanisms that you have introduced in your own member countries? Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks very much, Keiko. I hope you can hear me as well. And very pleased to be part of this interesting exchange this morning from London. And Keiko, you already kind of painted the whole environment that we're looking at when it comes to gender responsive procurement. On the one hand, of course, it's all about supporting the development of women entrepreneurship, and that this is achieved through the classic means of providing access to finance and promoting access to knowledge for women-led or women-owned businesses so that they can actually participate in public procurement processes at an equal footing with other businesses. And then the second part is really about reviewing procurement processes for these hidden biases, for these unknown sort of and unintentional aspects that kind of tend to affect women-owned businesses more negatively than others. So I've come with some examples on both of these, and maybe the first one that I wanted to note today builds on something that we have already heard a little bit from my colleague Eliza that was in the previous session. For those that attended, we spoke briefly about EBRD's work with Source and Prosoro in Ukraine. So here the idea is really to fully bring the full infrastructure project cycle into one integrated online platform where we have the project preparation, the tender preparation, the tendering process, and also then the contract management, all part of an integrated system. So I think this is particularly relevant given the focus of our session as well. And as Eliza mentioned, this platform actually required a lot of customization work to make Source work for the Ukrainian context. And when we started this work, we actually realized that there was an opportunity to strengthen the way that gender and economic inclusion considerations are reflected in the tool, so they can become part of project preparation and the procurement process, not in a way that would prescribe these aspects, but rather in a way that would prompt procurement and project preparation professionals to think about these questions and really ask themselves, do they constitute a barrier in this specific project that is necessary or that can actually be alleviated, leading to a larger pool of competitors when it comes to the actual bidding process. So obviously, this idea of systematically integrating gender considerations into infrastructure project is a priority for the EBRD. We're just about to launch our new strategy for the promotion of gender equality, hopefully to be approved this week. And one way of ensuring gender responsive infrastructure at the outcome level is, of course, to integrate these considerations already at the preparation and design stage. So what we did in the example of the Source to Prosoro project in Ukraine is we engaged an expert to really review the national infrastructure project cycle from a gender perspective and also provide updates for the platform that really reflect the gender considerations and also develop some templates for the users of the platform on how to integrate gender in a more mindful manner into their project development and procurement. So basically there are two main sets, I would say, of changes to the platform that this project implemented. On the one hand, there are some core questions that are really about like the gender mainstreaming processes that could be followed in the development of a program. this ranges from project definition, project appraisal, both from an investment and a procurement perspective, and then also to the project structuring. And then there were some amendments to existing questions where we basically prompted the user to make sure that the technical assessments are done in a gender disaggregated manner. And I think this is a key example to actually show how small changes can then actually affect the, let's say, gender outcomes of procurement processes. Because if we in these sort of platforms, if we ask, for instance, for data on users about a specific infrastructure project, if we don't actually make sure that this data is being collected and recorded in a gender disaggregated manner, we may well sort of miss out on differences between men and women in using this infrastructure and benefiting from this infrastructure. And by prompting the user to actually think about this, we may well catch some of these incidences of involuntary discrimination in projects. And this, let's say, adjustments in terms of questions and templates were then also complemented with some tooltips that provide further explanations and best practices, and also links to maybe international guidance tools, indicators that can be used to integrate these considerations. Because I think, again, the idea is not to prescribe something, but rather to provide the procurement professional with all the best practices and guidance that they can then build on and integrate into their project to the extent that it makes sense for the envisaged outcome. So at this stage, we have implemented these changes, these technical changes to the platform, and we're now in the stage of piloting the platform and training public authorities in Ukraine on the use, including on the gender and economic inclusion aspects. And I think one additional benefit that this type of engagement brings is actually that because we now have a more integrated way of looking at gender and inclusion aspects as part of this e-platform, we're collecting this data, we're reporting this data, and that makes it also much easier to actually communicate the overall impact that procurement can have on the SDGs, for instance, SDG 5 on gender equality. So basically, what the platform currently does is kind of aggregating the impacts that are being achieved across all the procurement processes being led on the platform to, let's say, one snapshot that really talks about the benefits that have been achieved through the integration of gender and inclusion considerations into the platform, which I think is a really nice way for also procurement professionals to kind of connect with the larger development agenda and sort of really make those links very visible. So that's on the sort of way of integrating gender considerations as part of e-procurement platforms. I also wanted to briefly talk about how we actually support women at the level of the contractors' workforce in our infrastructure projects, basically leveraging the procurement process to achieve these outcomes. So again, it's not about preferential treatment of women-led companies, but it's about helping contractors to integrate gender considerations in their own operations, which we, for instance, done in a number of projects in the Western Balkans. In the Western Balkans, the EBRD finances a lot of large construction projects, especially in the road sector. And what we did there was that as part of the mandatory scope of work, so not part of the evaluation criteria of the bids, but of the mandatory scope of work, we included gender and inclusion activities that shall be carried out by the contractors. So this could be stuff like on-site training or mentorship programs, the development of gender action plans by the contractors. And we would typically support this with information sessions at the pre-tendering stage, so that all contractors or all potential bidders are aware of the requirements. And we would then also support during the mobilization stage, we would support the contractors with the assessment and also the drafting of the relevant activities, the gender action plans. And what I wanted to sort of end on here is that this is really not to make procurement processes more complicated or sort of make the work of the contractors more complicated. It's actually about addressing a key challenge that they are facing. And this is especially urgent in the Western Balkans, where we have these huge labor gaps, especially in the construction sector, where we know that actually this lack of access to qualified workers is one of the key reasons for poor project performance and cost overruns. So if we actually enable our contractors to engage with questions such as workforce diversity. How are they sourcing their talents? How can they upskill people that are maybe traditionally not part of their workforce? This actually creates these win-win situations of contractors being able to address their labor gaps, while we're also opening up economic opportunities for women and other underserved groups. So maybe I'll stop at that point. Obviously, there's the whole world around just supporting women businesses through access to finance and knowledge. And you also mentioned already the important work around supporting sex disaggregated data collection and this unified definition of SMEs that are led by women, which is also something that the EBRD works on. But maybe we'll focus on the very procurement focused aspect for the moment, and we take more questions later in the open part. Thanks, Keiko.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Also very interesting about EBRD's work in this area, and very kind of comprehensive, looking at the data and that important point that you made about how we need that data to be able to see where are I think you referred to it as the involuntary biases in procurement processes. So again, about where are the tweaks that can perhaps strengthen procurement, support contractors, and also kind of promote the diversity of supply chains. And there's increasing evidence about the importance of supply diversity and for economic growth. So I think not just for women-owned businesses, but more broadly. So I think these are really great points, and the different work that you're doing on training, also great, really important points. So I'd like to now turn to our colleague from the World Bank Group, Despoina Curia, who's joining us from Luxembourg today. And so we've now heard from different multilateral development banks on how they've been working on gender responsive procurement in their in operations and projects. But the World Bank also is quite unique amongst the MDB group for setting its own targets. Could you describe why and how the World Bank started to introduce gender responsive procurement, and any results so far? Over to you.
Thank you, Keiko, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Connecting from Luxembourg, as Keiko said. My name is Despoina Curia. I'm working at the Corporate Procurement Unit at the World Bank Group as part of the Sustainability and Supply Diversity team. So going to Keiko's question of, indeed, the World Bank Group has a specific program on promoting and increasing the participation of women-owned businesses, as well as minority-owned businesses and other diverse-owned groups. So going back to the why we initiated the program, I have to say that a lot of the reasons behind the business case for that came actually from our operations work. So the World Bank Group has been promoting gender equality for more than 2 decades through, lending, grants, knowledge, and policy dialogue. We are mainstreaming gender as part of operations, and on the private side, the IFC is really working with the private sector to promote women's economic empowerment, to support access of women to capital and markets, and also provide the tools necessary for women to enhance their capacities and confidence to access corporate projects. So it is this operation work that I would say really inspired and provided also the senior level management to look inside and see what we are doing within our own procurement processes, and how we can actually walk the talk of the work that we're doing globally with our partners. So back in 2018, we launched our supplier diversity commitments. We did a baseline exercise to try to understand what percentage of our current procurement spend goes to women-owned and other diverse-owned businesses. Corporate procurement at the World Bank Group, we annually procure from on average 1.5 to 2 billion US dollars for goods and services. So there is a really substantial purchasing power and leverage that we can drive change through our supply chain and through our collective purchasing power. So our baseline exercise in 2018 revealed that a bit over 3.1, I would say, % of our corporate procurement spend was channeled to women-owned businesses, which, as it may sound quite small, but as both Keiko and Leslie presented earlier, compared to the 1% that we see on average globally, it was a bit better. Nevertheless, we thought that it would be really important for the World Bank Group and with the support, as I said, of the senior management to set a target. And that target was to more than double our corporate procurement spend with women-owned businesses to reach 7% by 2023. Similarly, I would say I will take the advantage to say that similarly last year, we also are looking on minority-owned businesses, and we have set an equivalent target to increase our spend from 4.2% to 8% by 2025. So our supply diversity and inclusion program is really built upon these goals and commitments. Now, obviously, in order to reach those goals and commitments, we have set up a program which is based, I would say, on 4 levels, if I could outline. So the first level of our supply diversity efforts rely on process improvement. So what we can do within our own policies, procurement procedures, roles and responsibilities to ensure that supply diversity considerations are embedded within those procurement practices. The second level of our approach has to do with technology support. So it is very important to have the systems in place that allow us, as Teresa said, provide data to be in a position to track and monitor and report on our procurement spend that goes towards women-owned and other diverse-owned businesses. We were fortunate at the World Bank Group at corporate procurement that our current systems already captured disaggregate data, and we were, in that sense, able to both do the baseline exercise, but also we are in a position to capture, track, and report on our spend with women-owned and other diverse-owned businesses on an annual basis. So on the technology support, then I would also say that another aspect of ensuring that we have systems in place that enable us to identify women-owned businesses, but also equally important is for business-owned businesses, women-owned businesses to identify us. So we are actually looking forward to enhance and improve our systems to make sure that vendors that may not be currently working with the World Bank Group, so companies, women-owned companies that are interested to work with the World Bank Group, have the possibility to share information about their expertise and what we call register the business within what we call a supplier circle within our new forthcoming e-procurement system. The third level of a program looks at capacity building and outreach, and this goes both into internal capacity building and raising awareness to make sure that our procurement practitioners and requisitioners are really engaged and aware of our commitments and why and how we can support the increase and promotion of women-owned businesses within our procurement process supply chain. Equally important, though, we see the external capacity building and outreach to the vendor community of women-owned businesses. So we really engage into meet the buyer events, so what we call vendor forums, to make sure that we demystify our corporate procurement processes and increase the understanding of women-owned businesses of where they can find corporate procurement opportunities in the World Bank Group and how they can access those, what are the requirements, what are the procedures. Finally, partnerships. These are equally important, both internally, as I said, we make sure to connect with the different business units and the different departments within the World Bank that support the promotion of gender equality, women's economic empowerment, as this is part, of walking the talk, as I said. But equally important is external partnerships. So we are we're collaborating with different organizations, including both other multilateral development banks, as well as the UN system. We're part of a gender responsive working group to make sure that we exchange knowledge, lessons learned, and experiences. We're also part of organizations, of NGO organizations who are certifying women-owned businesses, both within the US, but as well as globally. So one of them is WeBank, the second one is We Connect International. And we see those partners also important to ensure that we understand what other corporate buyers are doing, but also connect and have the possibility to identify women-owned businesses. In conclusion, I would say where we're standing in terms of our goal. As I said, we had the goal moving from a 3.1% to 7% by 2025. We at the moment are at above 5%. So we closed the fiscal year 21 with over 5% of our corporate procurement spend towards women-owned businesses. Obviously, besides the downturn of the COVID and the impact it had on our buying, this is a great result. But we definitely recognize that we still have a long way to go when we are intensifying our efforts in the next couple of years to meet our goals, but also surpass and overall, increase and further develop our program. So I'll stop here and I'm happy to take on further questions. Thanks, Keiko.
Thank you so much. Those 4 steps are very useful for people like the ADB, where we are also beginning that discussion on how we can also perhaps walk the talk. Like our kind of fellow MDBs here, we have a kind of a strong commitment on gender equality. It is one of our operational priorities, as Rubina kind of highlighted. And we have this commitment, a corporate target of 75% of our operations to promote gender equality by 2030. We're actually quite close to already meeting that in 2021. So we're very proud of that, but it's also how can we also extend that support that we have on women's entrepreneurship into other kind of areas in terms of access to markets and how to reflect that back on us as an institution. This is also now like time for an open panel, and just had some kind of questions and would like to kind of invite everyone to also put in additional questions into the chat, and our experts will be happy to respond. So first of all, so I think there was already a question about some of the challenges of reconciling procurement with gender equality objectives. So where are the main challenges in creating equitable procurement opportunities? And this is kind of open to any one of our panelists, or I might just kind of perhaps ask my colleague first. Well, Despina, you're still online, so do you want to take this first?
Yes, exactly. I was still unmuted, so I want to chime in there. I think when looking at the challenges, we really need to start by looking at, and Leslie already pointed out, and you as well, Keiko, on what are the challenges that women-owned businesses face into accessing procurement, and how we can ensure that our processes they tackle this gender gap that seems to appear. I think what we come to realize is that there is we see a lack of information and awareness on procurement opportunities on the side of women-owned businesses. Keiko, you already mentioned that, this is what we see also from at the World Bank Group. We see that women-owned businesses tend to be on the smaller size, small and medium-sized enterprises, which often lack the human financial resources to actively compete for contracts, but also go after contract opportunities. They may not have the time to do active business development. So it is important in that sense, and this is what we focus our efforts at the World Bank, important to really bring them in the loop and make sure that we channel towards them the different opportunities there are to compete for contracts. So including them in sourcing opportunities as much as possible. I think equally important is to ensure that the processes, our procurement processes, are streamlined and simple, so that women-owned businesses they don't have they don't expect they see a process where they know how to go about it, and it stays the same throughout different opportunities, and they know what to expect and how they can prepare. With our interaction with the women-owned businesses, we get the feedback, at least for the World Bank Group, that many times women-owned businesses feel intimidated or scared to compete for contracts like of different multilateral and development banks. So that's why we really place a lot of focus on ensuring that we demystify, we spell any myths on our processes, and ensure that women-owned businesses know how to go about, how to access our opportunities, how to compete, how they can register, where they can find contracts. What I would like also to highlight is it is important also to share feedback. I mean, to those women-owned businesses that they're not successful, it's important to make sure that we channel feedback back to them. And I think we're hearing this all the time from during our vendor forums and our interactions, that they really need this feedback to understand where they're mistaken, and what are the room and ways of them to improve and compete in the future. Finally, I wanted to point out that another avenue for women-owned businesses to access contracts is through subcontracting. Considering that women-owned businesses are small, and often they're small or medium enterprises, and might not have the capacities to compete for larger projects in the beginning, it is important to help them build their expertise and to build their capacities. So we really, at the World Bank Group, we have a Tier 2 program. So we're working with our prime non-diverse vendors to promote that they engage and involve women-owned businesses when doing and servicing their World Bank Group contracts, as well as across their supply chain. We monitor and collect information on an annual basis from our vendor community on their expenditure and engagement with women-owned businesses and other diverse-owned vendors, and we actually capture this information as our Tier 2 diverse spend. So I would, that was what I could say at this moment, and happy to hear what others may want to add in.
And maybe just a direct reflection on this, Despina, because I mean, everything you said, this is not just good for women, right? This is good for everyone. What you're talking about, that we're going to simplify processes, that we're going to demystify procurement from MDBs, these are all things that will benefit everyone. And so I think this is another very important point when it comes to this topic of non-discrimination. We are actually just reducing barriers. and this is going to benefit women, men, and any other entrepreneur that is interested in taking up opportunities with the Multilateral Development Bank, but also with our clients.
Thanks, Teresa. Anyone else want to answer that first question on other kind of challenges and creating equitable opportunities?
Keiko, if I may add, and just going for what Teresa just said, indeed, and I think, Keiko, you also mentioned in the beginning, it is important also to see that the requirements that we're putting on both the technical capacity but also the financial capacity, they're not over challenging compared to the contract sizes. So these are also important, and this is an issue that we try to promote within the corporate procurement, our colleagues, ensuring that where possible, for instance, we can unbundle contracts to create lots to give the possibility to smaller size women-owned businesses to access those, and making sure requirements are equivalent and proportional to the contract size and value, and obviously making sure that the payment terms are flexible and that they don't create unintentional barriers into the participation of small women-owned businesses. So that would be just a quick add-on.
Thanks, Tisbin. Very good points. And I see a comment in the questions that Shambu, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says great feedback and very informative. So great. I'm glad that this session is really kind of raising awareness, and that kind of segues to my next question. So gender responsive procurement is becoming, or is emerging as a very important topic amongst gender specialists such as myself, and increasingly, as we've heard from this panel, amongst procurement specialists too, but it's still very much emerging. It may be of interest for some that the multilateral development banks next year have a gender summit. This happens every 2 years, and one of the topics will be gender responsive procurement, actually. So this is the first time that will be addressed. So it really is emerging. But so what are the kind of activities or programs that we can support to raise awareness about gender responsive procurement? And what would you advocate in supporting stronger capacity, technical capacity on GRP? So this is open to anyone who would like to answer.
I can start. I think one of the most important things is ongoing training. It can't be a one-off thing, especially as this is a relatively new area for a lot of procurement officers and specialists. So I think it's important that the gender perspective be taken into account in, like, when a procurement officer is being onboarded, that it's part of their training along with the core principles of public procurement. This needs to be something that really becomes an inherent part of any program to promote women in public procurement. So I think that's something that's key.
And I think it's also nice when we always say, the women-led businesses, they should inform themselves more about opportunities to participate in procurement. I think we should also take on the responsibility ourselves as procurement professionals to educate and stay abreast of sort of like the latest developments in this area. And just to share one example of how we at the EBRD are kind of supporting this. So since 2012 already, we have this international professional master program in collaboration with the University Tor Vergata in Rome, and also with the University of Belgrade, for public procurement professionals. So this is a professional master, which basically provides the procurement professionals from our region with knowledge about like best practices in the area of procurement, and it integrates a module on procurement and gender. And we always aim to make sure that this module actually reflects, let's say, the latest developments in this area, because if we already instill this knowledge into professionals early in their career, I think they can also sort of learn by doing a little bit. Like we are all very new in this field. Like, this is something that has only emerged over recent years. So I think it's also okay to acknowledge that we are in this learning process, and that we still need to gather more information. And that's why events like this one today is really great to exchange on our latest ideas and activities.
Thanks, Teresa. I also noted, I think, in Leslie's PowerPoint, some references to toolkits, and it'll be really great if perhaps I'll maybe ask the panelists to share some of their own institutions work and research on gender responsive procurement that we can perhaps share with the participants who are interested in delving a bit deeper, and also looking at other training opportunities that may exist in our region or online. So that's those are really great points. We are kind of very quickly running out of time. If there's any other questions, I don't see anything else. So, okay, so for you, Teresa, so gender sensitive procurement, does this increase time and does it have cost implications? I think this could be also open to anyone else on this panel.
So I think actually what we have observed in the contracts where we have implemented these kind of provisions, the costs allocated or the provisional sum allocated to these type of interventions is actually tiny compared to the overall contract size. So I think this is something to keep in mind. We of course put some money aside to sort of like enable for the facilitation of this work, but it's not comparable to the overall size of projects in the infrastructure sector. And if we keep in mind that these provisions actually enable timely completion of projects and other sort of performance measures to be kept, then I think it's actually a very small investment to be made into like the success of a project.
Thank you, Teresa. Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, just if I can add last point only that what our colleagues have been talking about on this gender and the procurement, because if I'm the procurement specialist, I'm fixated with my own thinking of the procurement, and then we have a lot of resources within ADB on the gender specialist. And this is nothing new as such, to be honest, with ADB, because we are already applying this. We are, as I said in my discussion in the beginning, that we are already applying the gender responsiveness or inclusion in our infrastructure projects, or those elements are already there. Maybe I think perhaps it's a mindset and to create more awareness, not only before going out to our clients. I think internally also we have to join hand the procurement and the gender team and learn from each other. And then we go to our executing and implementing agency to update on this one. So we have already wealth of knowledge within ourselves. And it's just now time to just be creating more awareness and sharing our experiences with our clients. There's a gender action plan. All our projects, they do already have in our projects. And as I think Teresa mentioned about the provisional sum, yes, it's a very nominal amount. It's already there in the bidding document. So it's not a very cost expensive in terms of the project. I think it's only spending some resources and paying some more attention to the details. So with less resources, we can do more. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina. Less is more. I think this is a great message. So there's a question that sustainable procurement complements gender responsive actions. I think everybody would probably agree with that. So in terms of, and that's how, let's say, for example, the ADB, and we've also heard from the other MDBs, how this, and Rubina has also kind of reminded us about how procurement and gender specialists need to work together. This is very much where this session kind of came together at the beginning, is how do we start that discussion on, we want to be able to promote women's owned businesses, and MDBs such as the ADB and others have been doing that a lot through providing skills training, access to finance for women-owned businesses, but there are other mechanisms and processes that we can also look at, and one of those is procurement. So this is, so they're very much complementary, as you say, so, and that's how, and I think one of the key messages that you can see just from this panel, that a wide range of multilateral development banks working across, I mean, other than perhaps Africa, where we're pretty well covered in terms of global regions, this is becoming an emerging priority for many of us. And I think this is, and there's still a lot of learning and more data to be done. And I think we've learned a lot from the different panelists. This is kind of also by way of conclusion, because I'm seeing Roger's joined us. So I think this means that a bell is being rung, that we need to unfortunately close this session. I'd like to thank all the panelists for, especially Leslie, for a great presentation to introduce and I think it's very early or very late wherever you are, Leslie. So thank you very much for joining us live and for that great presentation. I think we saw from Galia earlier that, or the organizers earlier, that the presentation will be shared, and we'll also be asking the panelists to share any other of the materials that they've referred to if you're interested in learning a bit more about gender responsive procurement. This has been a great learning experience for myself. I've learned a lot also from my other colleagues from other MDBs and from my colleague Rubina from the ADB. So it's hard to kind of conclude, and the big summaries are there are many opportunities to tweak, streamline, looking at procurement processes that are an investment, but they have a lot of development gains as well as economic gains. There is a really strong business case of supplier diversity, and that's not only just for women-owned businesses, but that's just in general in terms of also we've heard from other our colleagues from EBRD and Inter-American Development Bank of also sourcing from Indigenous groups, ethnic minorities, LGBT. So there really is a business case for that supply diversity. And there are many kind of ways that we can use the mechanisms that already exist in procurement, such as roadshows, as Rubina mentioned, looking at data platforms, looking at EGP, to go back to the theme of this conference, and to try to see how we can actually even out uneven playing field, even though procurement looks gender neutral. Unfortunately, at the moment, given the data of 1% kind of global public procurement going to women-owned businesses, there's clearly an inequality and a gap there to be addressed. So again, this is the beginning of a conversation, and thank you to all the panelists and to the participants for staying on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keiko. We really appreciate you facilitating, moderating this really important topic. And thank you to all of our panelists for your awesome presentations and insights and taking the time to address a lot of the questions. Also, thank you to the participants for submitting your questions, your thoughts, your comments. We saw them coming through the chat, so we definitely appreciate that. So before all of you leave, we want to take a quick group picture. I will remove myself in a moment, and then we were going to take a group picture with all the panelists. There we go. I'm out of the way now. All right, so go ahead and smile for the camera that you cannot see, but trust us, is there. Great, thank you so much. All right, so now you should see a couple of, or actually a few poll questions that are going to be coming your way before we go into a break. So let's get the first question brought up onto the screen. We'd love your feedback here. We're going to run these very quickly. So based on your own experience and practices and what you've seen, are there as many women-owned businesses as male-owned businesses? So these questions are coming from our moderator and panelists, and they'd love to know your thoughts and what you're seeing where you're located. So take a moment to respond very quickly, yes, no, or I'm not exactly sure how many. And I see right here that there are not, so far it seems that the main answer here, or the leading answer here, is that there are not as many women-owned businesses as male-owned businesses. Go ahead and submit your response. You should see this poll popped up right in front of you on the Zoom app. So go ahead and take a moment to quickly respond to this. Great, we see the responses coming in, and it seems, unfortunately, we still see no. No is still the leading answer. We thank you for that participation. If you haven't responded yet, go ahead and do so right now. And we are going to have our next question coming up in a moment. All right, there you go. All right, that poll has ended. Now here we have our next question coming up, which you should see popping up on your screen in a moment. Let's see here. What is the estimated share of global public procurement that goes to women-owned businesses? So again, based on your own experiences, what you're seeing in your part of the world, in your country, in your market, what is the estimated share of global procurement that goes to women-owned businesses? What would your response be there? So We see a few answers coming in, about 10%. And of course, these are rough estimates. So, if it's anywhere near 10% or closer to 50, go ahead and say 50. But it looks like we're seeing 10% is roughly what is coming through here as the leading response. A few of you don't know, and that's okay. But I see here 10% continues to be the leading response here. There's some of you here, a handful, that suggest about 33% is the estimated share of global procurement that is going to women-owned businesses. Again, what are you seeing in your markets? What's your experience, or what do you believe is the case here, what that percentage might be? All right, we're going to wrap this poll up. There we go. It looks like about 10% is what everyone, or the majority, were agreeing with. And now we're going to have another poll question coming in. So stay tuned for this one. All right. What are the advantages of gender responsive procurement? What are the advantages of gender responsive procurement? So we have a few options here. One, A is support in order to support women-owned businesses to access markets and clients. B, supporting diversity of supply chains. C, promote labor codes and policies that protect female workers. Or D, all of the above. It looks like overwhelmingly the audience believes and agrees that all of the above are definitely advantages of gender responsive procurement. Looks like we have about 30% of the group who has responded. If you haven't done so yet, let us know where you stand on this particular thought and what you believe the advantages are of gender responsive procurement. All right, thank you so much. We see more people coming in with their contributions to this poll. There we go. Almost done with this poll, and it looks like the overwhelming majority agree that these three items, all of the above, are significant advantages. All right, we've got another question coming up here, and I promise you we are going to go right into a short break after these. All right, the next question here is, does your country have any policies on gender responsive procurement? So again, referring to and considering your market and your country, where do they stand at the moment? Does your country have any policies on gender responsive procurement? Looks like the overwhelming answer so far is no. So it looks like there is an opportunity here for change. The overwhelming majority, again, is still no, as more responses continue to come in. All right, so go ahead. If you see the poll, please go ahead and submit your response. Does your country have any policies on gender responsive procurement? Unfortunately, it looks like the answer is still no there, but this is important. If this is what it is, there is an opportunity here to start making changes. Thank you so much for sharing your response. If you haven't yet submitted a response, go ahead and do so now. All right, and we're going to start closing this poll in a moment. All right, last and final question. Question number 5 should be popping up on your screen in a moment. Okay, do you think that gender responsive procurement could add value to your country's procurement practices? Do you believe that gender responsive procurement could add value to your country's procurement practices? Yes, no, perhaps you don't know right now, or you have not considered it. And that is, of course, totally okay. So let us know where you stand on this one. This will, again, help our moderators and our panelists understand, just where things are globally and in the region and where things currently stand. So it looks like we have about almost 50% participation in this poll. If you haven't answered yet, do you think gender responsive procurement could add value to your country's procurement practices? And it looks like the overwhelming majority believe that yes, that gender responsive procurement could add value to your country's procurement practices. And I think we are just about ending the poll now. There we go. So it looks like that came in loud and clear right over there. So this concludes session number 2 for our third and final day here. We're now going to take a short break, and we will return in about 10 minutes, it looks like, so that we can begin our next session at 4:30 p.m. Local Manila time. Do take this time to respond to any emails or messages so that you can be ready to give us your full attention on this valuable final session of the day. We will also be following that up with some closing remarks. And lastly, we do have have a question that is going to flash on the screen during that break, and we'd love to know your thoughts. What are some key ideas that you've taken away from the conference so far? Something that perhaps you're going to take action on in the next couple of weeks. So we'll have that question pop up on the screen in a moment. You'll see a video from some of our partners, and there will be a countdown timer as we get close to the end of the break. But we have about, looks like 9 to 10 minutes left before we start our final session at 4:30 p.m. local Manila time. So keep the Zoom channel open so you can see the remaining time, and we will see you shortly.